Hey, you guys. So this is the PowerPoint for surveys, just because there's a lot going on today, and I know how many of you guys kind of are interested in doing a survey, so I thought I would go over it kind of in depth. All right, so first you should know sometimes it's going to be appropriate to, instead of just creating a survey from scratch, we have what are called instruments that are already created on a variety of psychological or sociological topics. And it's perfectly fine to use one of those, even adapt one of them for your study, and then to cite that instrument. So, for example, if you are interested in measuring depression or anxiety or self esteem or learning behaviors or developmental milestones, as just in terms of some psychological variables, then there are instruments that already exist to measure those things, and all you would do is you would find them. I linked some here that are psychological. These are diagnostics that are used for mental health kind of things. But for sure, there's other instruments that are used for topics such as, biases, if people are more likely to help each other, all sorts of kinds of things. Okay, so a survey is going to be the example method we use to talk about a mixed methods approach. But technically, a mixed methods design is anything that combines qualitative and quantitative information to fully understand. So I'm going to ask people maybe a series of questions that have a number response associated with them, as well as I'm going to ask them to describe something using words. I'm going to use both to get like a clearer picture. So, for example, if I wanted to know more about your preferences for restaurants in Northwest Arkansas, then I might ask you to tell me about your favorite Italian restaurant, tell me about your favorite American restaurant, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I might also ask you to rate on a scale of 1 through 5, like a series of restaurants compared to each other, maybe rank them together also. So because I'm asking you both to describe something using words and I'm associating a score or a number with it, then it would be a mixed methods kind of approach that I would be doing. Surveys have a benefit of being able to use mixed methods pretty often, so that's why we're talking about them today. So why do people use a survey? I read somewhere that AP research students really, really, really like surveys. It's something like 2/3 of all studies in this class tend to use surveys, something like that. And the reason why is because surveys are super easy to do. It's super efficient way to collect information about a large population. You can use a survey to measure all sorts of things, such as attitudes, knowledge, preferences, etc. It's standardized, so everyone's getting the same survey as opposed to an interview, which might change a little bit depending upon who you're interviewing, what the responses are. And then it's really easy to tailor a survey that already exists to your population. All right, so at the start of every survey, there is an introductory statement. I cut out an example below, but typically ours is going to look like this format. So you have a brief summary, and when I say brief, I mean think about your general audience. You want to keep it brief. So we want to tell them what the main purpose of the survey is. You can make it vague if you need to, but for the most part, we want to be sort of upfront about what they're talking about. We're going to include an informed consent statement. So we'll talk about what an informed consent statement is in the IRB/ethics discussion that's coming up in like a week and a half, I think. I have a really easy format for you to kind of follow with that. So no worries there. You want to motivate the respondent to complete the survey. So you might thank them for their time. You might let them know how some of the results are going to be used, who they're going to benefit, that kind of thing. You always want to give an estimate of the time it takes to complete. So if it's going to take just a few minutes or if this is going to be a 20 to 30 minute thing. And you want to thank the participant typically for doing this out of their own time. And then a lot of times you'll provide contact information about if they want to know more about the survey results whenever you are finished analyzing it. All right, so here's the problems with surveys, because sometimes it can be so easy to think about how nice and simple they might be that we're missing out on some complexities. So some issues that I have with surveys are that it's kind of difficult to write questions in a way that you're getting responses that are useful, but you're also not getting any of these biased responses. So we're going to talk in depth about bias when it comes to surveys. Low response rate is really tricky because you're high school students, right? And so it's difficult for you to ask your fellow high school students because we make you get a participant or a parent form signed. But it's also tricky for you to talk to adults because of ethical reasons, right? I can't just have you stand on the corner of Walmart and just interview all the adults without maybe another adult present. That's just kind of creepy. On your part, I'd be worried about your safety. And so low response rate has kind of plagued students in the past because of your age and your lack of being able to prove your credibility to a more general audience. There's also the fact that typical surveys can provide incentives to people, but we can't really do that very well. And then the other thing is just the type of people who do say yes to surveys are not necessarily a full pool of who you want to interview, right? So if you want me to interview people about their attitudes towards climate change, typically a lot of the people who answer have strong opinions, and that's great and wonderful. But if I want a wide variety of people's attitudes towards this topic, then it's hard to get that sort of middle ground also. You tend to get the extremists on either side. The other thing is participation fatigue. People are not great. People are not great at surveys. They tend to get tired if you make them do them for too long. They don't always answer how you want them to answer. They're not very careful readers. If they can guess what a survey is about, then they will respond as such. If you have a bunch of agree and then disagree statements, then if you sort of switch it halfway through to where they're agreeing to the wrong thing, they will continue to answer agree to everything. It's kind of easy for people to be both biased in their responses and to not read carefully. And then finally, depending upon the survey, there can be a lot of issues with validity and reliability. So those are the two things we talked about. A, is this reliable? Does it always measure this thing? And then valid, does my survey measure what I am saying that it measures in the first place? All right, here are just some memes you can peruse in your own time about surveys. Okay, so writing survey question. We're going to talk about all the problems with surveys first before we talk about all the right ways to do them. So in this survey, participants were asked to indicate the issue matter most important to them in deciding who to vote for president in 2008, which is crazy to me that was so long ago for you. So I want you to see how whenever this is open-ended, an open-ended question is one that you're not giving people like an option. It's like a free response kind of question. So you'll see 35% of them talked about something like the economy, the war in Iraq was going on at the time, and then 43% had an other category. And they mention all of these things. Candidate mentions moral values, social issues, taxes, other, change, and other again. So there's lots of different others here, right? Which doesn't really help us out that much. So an open-ended question is where I let people just free response. And then I do something with that maybe. And then the second survey given, we changed it to close-ended questions. So close-ended questions are those that you're only given these options. So it's the same question, but now it's multiple choice. You have these 5 to choose from, and this is what people responded. So, and a lot of times we might start with kind of demoing a survey question by giving it to a small set of people, say your AP research classmates, that are open-ended questions, and then seeing how they respond to let you come up with what you're really trying to get to close-ended. Because if I'm interested in how people view the economy, then some of these other things don't really help me out. They don't really strengthen my argument. They don't really help me investigate how people view about the economy in terms of the presidential elections in 2008. I linked Pew Research because they have a really good thing that I pulled several of these things from on how to write survey questions and some things that kind of change over time. So they have some of these same examples. As well as I like that they have a variety of research topics that I think you guys are interested in, and all of these kinds of things. And so they have these really long surveys and questionnaires that they've given out to lots of different groups of people, and you can see the results there too. Okay. Another thing about surveys is you have to be thinking about the order in which you ask questions. This is for a variety of reasons. So the order in which we ask questions can prime people to think of their own beliefs in a way that is sometimes helpful and sometimes not helpful to us. So in this survey, people asked about if they were in favor of civil unions when asked after a question about same-sex marriage. This happened in 2003. So at the time, same-sex marriage was it was considered controversial. And so civil union, though, was sort of a way of getting to that without saying it. You'll notice that whenever people were asked first if they were in favor of legal agreements, then those in favor was 37%. And then it fell. And then asked second, it rose. So what this tells us is that probably whenever asked about legal agreements, people didn't really think about what that meant. The term legal agreements kind of makes me think of a lawyer, which might not be something that I have positive views about. But when they were asked about gay marriage first, that let them know, when we're talking about legal agreements, we're talking about legal agreements in terms of how that corresponds with civil unions and same-sex marriage. So now that I know kind of what we're talking about, then I might have higher responses. So this is an example of the way in which we ordered these questions helped us have a more truthful or honest view of what people's actual beliefs and attitudes were. Okay. Another thing to look out for is sometimes if you just give people only a few options, they're sort of forced to choose one, and their actual thoughts might be somewhere in between. So in this one, the question was the best way to ensure peace is through military strength. Again, this is from 1999, so it was a hot topic at the time. And you'll notice 55% versus 42%. So they could either agree or they could disagree. Or in this forced choice one, the best way to ensure peace is through military strength, or diplomacy is the best way to ensure peace. So in this one, they have kind of different formats. So agree or disagree bias is where people agree with you because they want to sort of please the researcher. We are super, super social beings, and so it's really common for us to want to sort of please, whether we're thinking about it or not, our researcher or the researcher in such a way that we agree with them. Okay. Some other examples of bias. So we are trying to reduce all of this in our survey so that we are able to really understand what people are trying to say. And by bias, I don't mean your bias. I mean the participant's bias and the way in which those biases tie together. So one thing to look out for is emotional language, especially maybe for emotional topics, right? So in this example, people were asked, would it be okay to make it legal for doctors to give terminally ill patients the means to end their lives versus making it legal for doctors to assist terminally ill patients in committing suicide? So I've got a couple of things that are emotional, right? Just the word suicide is a very loaded term. And then also kind of more subtle is making it legal for doctors to assist versus making it legal for doctors to give. Assist makes it sound like the patient is choosing something, or that the other way around. Making it legal for doctors to give terminally ill patients the means to end their own life makes it sound like the doctor is helping the patient make their own choice. Making it legal for doctors to assist terminally ill patients in committing suicide makes it sound like the doctors are more complicit within that decision. So you'll notice 51% in this less emotional language versus 44%. And the exact same question, but just now we're changing up our terms a few times. So if you're asking people about emotional topics, you want to think of how to phrase them in a way that doesn't automatically sort of set them up to answer a certain way. The next thing is a leading question. So a leading question is one that just by reading the question, I'm led to think that there is a right or a wrong answer. Do you think the school should cut the gym budget to pay for crossing guards, or should the school employ crossing guards to protect our children? So right here in this question, the second one, there's definitely a right answer. It's the one where the children are protected because I'm not a child non-protector, right? I don't hate the children. I don't kick them or trip them as they cross the street. And so, because there's clearly a right, ethical, societal accepted answer, I'm going to be more on your opinion here. Now, if I would have phrased that in such a way, if should the school employ crossing guards, even though it's going to dip into our tax funds that we allocated already for the art program, that's a leading question that leads me in the other direction. So now if I choose that one, I don't love art programs, and I definitely do. So that's a whole thing. So we want to ask questions that we might ask people to review over for us. Is there what seems like an obvious right or wrong answer? Like, would I be a bad person for answering this certain way? This is really tricky in questions where there definitely are right and wrong answers, and we're interested in studying that, right? So you might have questions about other people's bias, like homophobia or racism. And it's really interesting to look at surveys already out there that have sort of asked people about biases in a way that doesn't lead them to immediately deny that they have these attitudes or beliefs because they're societal accepted to not have them. All right, and then finally, participant bias. Participants are very, very biased people. They tend to underestimate everything bad about themselves. So if you ask people, like, tell me how often you use drugs, or you use alcohol, or you evade your taxes, or you tell little white lies to your partner, or you engage in racial bias, they will say that they are not terrible people, thank you very much, and they're a little offended that you would ask them such. But if you ask them how much charity they do, how many times they eat salads, or how often they run, how often they attend church services or help out in the community, then they're going to think of every positive instance that they did so, and they're going to report it sort of at a higher rate. Remember, if you ask everyone how smart they are in a population compared to the average, everyone will rate themselves higher than an average, even though that's not how averages work. So people also would like to please you. That's that affirmation bias. People say things that make the researcher that make them agree with the researcher. And then also people are aware that they're under observation in these surveys. And so they have a tendency to offer up the affirmative, whatever makes them look good. All right. So I had this little BuzzFeed quiz. Are you more of a Halloween person or a Christmas person? To talk a little bit about reliability and validity. So I wanted you to see about what this question was like to get an idea of what a bad say survey looks like. So on this, it's literally just Halloween person or Christmas person. I answered everything on the right side. I have no idea how a scarf or a boot emoji somehow correlates to fall or winter, or more particularly why I'm pretty sure the boot is winter and the scarf is fall. I have no idea how going to a bakery or watching a movie gives these things. This is also a good example of when you force people to choose whenever there are other options. And then Coco and Coraline both seem like movies that I think you would prefer if you liked Halloween. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense. So if I just choose everything on the right side, which I did, then I get, oh, dang, hold on. Oh, where did it go? Okay, sorry. I definitely took this earlier, and it gave me that I was a Christmas person just by picking all the right side. Okay, we'll return to this. All right, so here's how you write a good survey. Sorry. All right, some general tips. So first, you want to let people know what they're in for by having a progress bar. People, if they are not sure when the survey is over, might rush through it, or they might decide to do it later, or they might just not even respond if it's not just a one-page thing. So you got to let them know if it's more than one page, how long is this thing? It is best typically to list demographic questions afterwards. There was a really good example study done on, there was a survey conducted on how students viewed their own abilities in mathematics. And they found that when they asked the demographic questions first, as opposed to afterwards, girls then did worse on a math test and on an analysis of their own mathematical abilities, just by like reminding them that they were in fact girls. So demographic questions can make people think about what group identities they have, and therefore sort of tell them like, oh, okay, if they're asking me about gender or my political views, or my socioeconomic status, then I'm kind of already thinking about what my identity is, and therefore maybe how I should respond as a good member of my community. Or maybe I'm thinking about my own ingrained stereotypes about those groups of people, and that's giving me my response too. One thing that we already talked about, so consider your order of your questions, how will this influence responses, and then group questions into sections. This just kind of makes it easier for you to organize, easier for people to read to. All right, something we're going to do today is conducting a pilot study with open-ended questions so that we can create close-ended questions. Don't brainstorm the questions, brainstorm the types of answers you want people to have. Use simple, direct language. So I want you to think about your audience's Lexile score. Lexile score is like the reading level of the average person, right? So we see this a lot pop up when we're talking about presidential elections and about the sort of both the education level of the average like general person out in public versus the terminology, the level of education you would need to comprehend an argument. So whenever we're using surveys, we don't want to, I don't want to say dumb it down, but you don't want to use like jargon, right? You don't want to talk like you're writing your academic paper. You want it to be approachable, especially depending upon your audience. You want to have it adjusted for those audience members. And then be specific whenever possible. So if I ask this open-ended question, do you exercise regularly? I don't really know what that means. I'm instantly reminded that like yesterday I walked my dog, and surely that counts. But if you ask me how many days per week on average do I set aside for exercising myself and not my dog, then the answer falls sharply. So we want to be specific when possible so we can get to the real root of the matter. Okay, types of survey questions. Here we go. So this is kind of like how test questions look, right? So a test question can be multiple choice. Example here. A Likert scale is probably what you're most familiar with. Oh, I didn't link my examples. Dang it. Okay, we'll return to it. A Likert scale is essentially, here's a question, and then you're ranking it on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being I greatly disagree and 5 being I greatly agree, or maybe very dissatisfied versus very dissatisfied. So you've got a ranking of typically 5 options. 5 is pretty common, where there is like a true neutral. You can definitely say maybe to it. And then there is the kind ofs, and then the extreme agree or disagrees. Ranking questions is exactly what it sounds like. So rank these things on a scale of 1 to 5, like which one's your favorite, least favorite, which one do you like more, less more, etc. Dichotomous questions are any kind of question that only has 2 responses, yes or no, agree or disagree. You should never use this type of question if there is a maybe option. That's just forcing people to choose when there might be several options that you haven't yet explored. So an example would be, have you graduated high school? The answer is no, not yet. You're going to? Sure, very soon actually. But in the meantime, it's still a no. So we can use that question for a dichotomous question. Open-ended questions are things like what led you to choose this college. So I might be asking something that I want more detail on. I want a depth of detail. For open-ended questions, it's really nice sometimes because you can sort of understand how you might want to format a closed-ended question. It gives you a lot of data and information to work with, and then you start working on categorizing it. So on Tuesday, we're going to do an activity where we take open-ended questions and we sort them into categories to find closed-ended answers. And then demographic information, I think you should collect even if you don't really have a use for it yet or a plan for it. Sometimes some interesting demographic trends can pop up where you see a big difference between different populations of people, and that can be sort of interesting to talk about within your discussion section as well. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about reliability and validity some more. So these are 3 personality tests, 4 if you count the Harry Potter version I linked here. And they all kind of ask sort of similar test questions, right? They have a similar format. They provide a scenario or a general statement. And then they use a Likert scale to talk about, like on a scale of 1 to 5, how much does this describe you? So of these, the Hexaco is the big 5 personality tests plus one new one they've added called the honesty and humility spectrum. This is considered pretty reliable and pretty valid by psychologists. Meanwhile, the ones you're probably more familiar with are the Enneagram and the Myers-Briggs personality test. And both of these tests are super, super popular. They're really fun to do, honestly. I don't know my Hexaco score off the top of my head, but I know my Enneagram and my Myers-Briggs off the top of my head. However, they've been shown not to be super reliable or valid. This is because of a couple of things sort of within the theory of psychology and personality, which we're not going to get into. But I wanted to talk about how, like, the Myers-Briggs especially has this statistic with it. So if you retake the test after only a 5-week gap, there's 50% chance that you will fall into a different personality category. Your personality should not change that drastically, like ever. So that's a concerning sign that things are not either valid or reliable. So whenever we're conducting surveys, we want to maybe give our survey to the same person more than one time as a test to see if they keep getting back the same responses or answers about their attitudes, their perspectives, their knowledge, because otherwise we might not have a very valid test. The other thing reliable tests. The other thing is they've both been criticized for not being valid because they sort of force people into a dichotomy. So if you are an extrovert in the Myers-Briggs personality test, and let's say you get like 55% extrovert, then you're labeled the exact same way as if you got 99% extrovert. So they really shuttle you off into 2 categories without saying that there's like a spectrum of things. And both of them also, you kind of have, how to put this, personality categories that read more like the fuddy-dudds of personalities. Like, you probably don't want them, right? When I'm reading this one, I'm like, ooh, enthusiast, challenger, and then investigator. Are you kidding me? And then loyalist sounds, I don't know. There's just several of them that just automatically sound like more fun, and some of them that don't sound as exciting. So you might answer in such a way, even not thinking about it, that leads you more to a personality type that you feel like you align with just based upon the categories or labels, because it's more socially acceptable to have that type of personality. Alrighty, so what we're going to do today, I'm just going to explain this really quickly. So a couple things. Okay. All right, so we finished talking about surveys. I attached this one below from Pew. I had to pick one that we don't talk about as much. This is their wording that they use in their surveys, as well as the percentages of people who responded. So you'll see there's some no answers. They include those in those results, but they don't calculate them usually. And then they have some Likert scale questions. So will definitely happen, will probably not happen, will definitely not happen. And so they've got one category for, do you think each of the following things will happen in the next 50 years before 2073? And then they have separate categories for how would you rate each of the following priorities for NASA space efforts. So on this one, we also have a Likert scale, but it would have been easy to make this a ranking question. So I like how Pew uses a lot of different types of Likert scale type questions to kind of get to how those would look. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I've attached this here. If you are online, I printed this off as a paper copy. If I try to open it as a Google document, it gets all wonky. So I'd like you to type it on a Google form, but this is the format we're kind of using or talking about. So I want you to list or describe your current research topic / question. Sorry, current research topic and then current research question. And then let's come up with sort of two aspects of your question that you might want to measure. Don't worry about the statistical part yet. We're just sort of splitting your question into two sort of main ideas. Then I want you to come up with 3 survey questions you can ask about each main idea, all right? Of those 3 survey questions, I'd like them to be each a different type. So for example, this might be an open-ended question. This one might be a scale question, like a Likert question, and then this one might be a ranking question. So I want you to do this even if you don't plan on conducting a survey, so that we can all have some practice kind of thinking about what makes a good survey, what makes a not great survey, and so on. And then we're going to give the survey to 5 people in class. That's our goal. And we're going to kind of look at our data. If you plan on doing a survey, this is your best way to figure out what questions work and what questions don't work. So of those 5 people in class, if you're doing this online, it would probably be easiest if you created your survey in the same format, but through Google Forms, and then sent it to your fellow classmates at BHS. Or if you would like to send it to me, I can distribute to some of my kids as well until you get 5 responses. Okay? Let me know if you have any questions. That's all, you guys.